Everybody in the yard knew the rule about Berth 9. You didn't go in. You didn't look too long. And whatever you did, you didn't talk to the thing that was parked there, because the people who'd talked to it before were not, by and large, still around to give advice. I broke all 3 rules in my first month, and I'm going to tell you why and what happened, but you have to be patient with me, because this is the kind of story that only makes sense if I build it the way it actually happened, slow from the bottom up. People hear a human made the ship kneel and they picture something loud. A battle, a speech. It wasn't loud. It was the quietest thing I've ever been part of. That's the part nobody believes. Let me start with the yard, because you have to understand the yard. It was called Taggart's Reach, though Taggart had been dead for 60 years and nobody knew anymore what he'd been reaching for. It was a scrapyard. The biggest one in the sector, maybe the biggest anywhere, a sprawl of berths and gantries and cooling ponds strung along the spine of a captured asteroid, way out past the shipping lanes where nobody respectable went. We took in the dead. That was the work. When a warship died, or a hauler broke its back, or a colony barge got too old to trust, it came to a place like ours to be taken apart, and we took it apart and we sold the pieces, and that was the whole economy of the Reach. Death disassembled by the kilo. It was cold, always cold. The asteroid kept its own miserable temperature, and the heaters in the work bays only ever fought it to a draw, so you worked in 3 layers and your fingers ached, and the metal you touched pulled the warmth right out of your gloves. There was a smell. There's always a smell in a scrapyard, ozone and coolant, and the particular Swedish rot of organic systems breaking down, alien blood analogs gone bad in tanks nobody had drained. You stopped smelling it after a week. Visitors never did. You could tell the new ones by the way they breathed through their mouths. And the sound. I want you to have the sound, because the sound is how I first knew something was wrong with Berth 9. A working scrapyard is never quiet. Cutting torches, the groan of gantries, the clang of plate hitting the sorting floor, the constant low argument of 1,000 machines doing violence to 1,000 dead ships. You lived inside that noise. It was the yard breathing. And there was exactly one place in the whole Reach where the noise stopped, where it went around like water goes around a stone, and that was Berth 9, and the silence there had a shape to it, and the shape was the ship. They called it the Mourner, not its real name. Nobody knew its real name or its make, or who'd built it, or which of the old wars it had come out of. It had drifted into compact space 40 years back, dead, dark, not answering hails, and the Sideric Compact. They're the ones who ran our sector, a tidy bureaucratic empire of about a dozen species who'd long ago decided that order was the highest virtue and unpredictability the only sin. The Compact had taken one look at it and been afraid. You have to understand how strange that was. The Compact wasn't afraid of things. They cataloged things. They had a department for everything, a form for everything, a regulation for the regulating of regulations. A dead drifting derelict was, to them, a routine matter: assess, document, disassemble, file. They'd processed 10,000 dead warships, but they took one look at the Mourner and they didn't disassemble it. They couldn't. 3 separate salvage crews went in to start the breakdown, and 3 separate salvage crews came out wrong. What came out at all? The records the Compact kept were thin and careful, the way records get when somebody's frightened of what's in them, but the shape was always the same. The crews would go in fine, and then the ship would do something. Nobody could ever say exactly what. The survivors talked about a sound, a pressure, a grief that came up through the deck plates and into your chest and wouldn't leave. Men who'd cut apart 100 warships went into the Mourner and came out unable to hold a torch, weeping at nothing, some of them never write again. So the Compact did the thing bureaucracies do when they can't solve a problem. They contained it. They built a quarantine berth around the Mourner, Berth 9, way out at the cold end of Taggart's Reach, and they posted regulations and they posted warnings and they posted, eventually, a guard, and then they left it there. 40 years. A ship the whole sector was frightened of, parked in a scrapyard, waiting, and nobody able to kill it, and nobody able to free it, and nobody able to so much as touch it. I got the real version of the salvage cruise much later, from Dossier, on a bad night near the end of all this, when he'd had enough of kettles still to finally talk. He'd been there for the third crew. That was the thing he never said out loud until that night. He hadn't just heard about the Mourner. He'd been on the crew that went in last, the one the compact sent after the first two failed, the one that was supposed to do it right. He told it slow, looking at his hands the whole time. The first crew, he said, went in hard and fast, the way you break a normal hull, torches up, charges set, peel it open and gut it before it can settle. They got maybe an hour in. Then something happened that none of them could ever describe the same way twice, and they came out at a dead run, and two of them never worked again, and one of them walked out an airlock 3 weeks later without his suit, and the compact wrote it up as equipment-related and sealed the file. The second crew went in careful. Slow, respectful, even like you'd approach a tomb. Didn't help. Same thing. The grief came up through the deck and into them, and it found whatever each of them was carrying, and everybody's carrying something. That's the thing, that's how it worked, and it pressed on it until it broke them. Dossier said the ship didn't attack. That was what he most wanted me to understand. It never attacked anyone. It just opened. It opened up its own grief, and you couldn't be near it without yours opening too. And most people's grief, if you open it all the way with no warning, is enough to drown them. His crew, the third, went in knowing all that. They went in braced. And Dossier said it was worse, not better, because bracing didn't work. You can't brace against the thing that's already inside you. He got maybe 2 hours. He won't say what it showed him. He lost a daughter years before the yard. That's all he'd ever tell anyone, and I think the ship found her, the way it found whatever you'd lost, and held it up in front of him until he couldn't stand. He crawled out, crawled on his hands the last stretch. And he never went down the cold end again, and he took the sorting floor and stayed there, and he was the one who warned every new hand off 9, and now I understood it wasn't superstition. It was a man trying to keep other people from meeting the thing that had nearly killed him with his own grief. It's not cruel, he told me that night, and his voice was strange. That's what nobody gets. It's not trying to hurt you. It's just so full of grief that being near it cracks you open, and it can't help it, and it doesn't want to, and that's the worst part, Patch. It doesn't want to hurt you. It just can't stop bleeding, and everyone who gets close bleeds with it. He looked at me then, and he knew by then where I'd been going at night, and he said, "Whatever you think you're doing down there, it's not a thing you can fix." And I didn't answer him, because I already knew he was wrong, and I already knew I couldn't explain how I knew without sounding like the first crew, the second crew, like every fool who'd thought they understood the Mourner and been carried out broken. I knew none of this when I took the job. I was running from things that aren't part of this story: debts, a marriage that had gone to ash, the usual human wreckage, and Taggart's Reach was hiring and didn't ask questions, and a berth technician's wage was a berth technician's wage. I came in green. They put me on the general crew, sorting plate, draining tanks, the bottom rung work, and for the first few days I just kept my head down and learned the yard. And I noticed Berth 9 the way you notice a held breath in a room. I asked about it, of course. You always ask about the thing nobody mentions, and the answers I got were the kind that tell you more by what they won't say. An old hand named Dossier, that wasn't his name, it was a yard name, everybody had one, I'd get mine soon enough, Dossier told me, not looking at me. You don't go down the cold end. 9's not ours, compact problem. They pay us to keep it parked, and we keep it parked, and we don't ask. And when I asked what was actually in it, he finally looked at me, and there was something in his face I didn't have a name for yet, and he said, "It's sad. That's the whole secret. It's the saddest thing in the galaxy, and it'll make you sad too, sad enough to die of it, so leave it alone." And he went back to his work and wouldn't say another word. The saddest thing in the galaxy. I thought he was being dramatic. Scrapyards run on superstition. Every yard's got a haunted hull and a cursed bay. I filed it under that and went back to sorting plate. But here's the thing about me. The thing that's the whole reason this is my story to tell and not somebody else's. I'm a fixer. Not in any grand way. When something's broken, I can't leave it. It's a sickness, honestly. My whole life broken things have called to me, and I've never once been able to walk past one without my hands wanting to know why. It's cost me. It cost me the marriage, some of it. You can't fix a person, turns out, and I broke myself a long time trying. But machines I could fix, and the worse broken a thing was the more it pulled at me. And there was, parked at the cold end of the yard, the most broken thing in the entire galaxy, humming its silence, waiting. You see where this is going. Everybody always sees where it's going except the person it's happening to. The guard didn't help. The compact kept one guard on Berth 9, and the guard was the strangest part of the whole arrangement, the part I couldn't stop turning over. It was a Sidaric, one of the compact's own enforcer caste, the species that did their policing, big armored things, four-legged, with a sensory crown of stalks where you'd expect a face. They were built for order, imposing, tireless, utterly correct. And the compact had posted one of them at Berth 9, alone, on a permanent rotation, and the guard never left. Never. It stood at the threshold of 9 at the line where the yard noise went quiet, and it faced the ship. Not the yard. The ship. For 40 years, compact guards had stood at that line and faced inward, watching the Mourner, and I came to understand much later that they didn't face it to keep us out. They faced it to keep watch on it. Because the compact, in all its order, was afraid that one day the saddest thing in the galaxy would decide it had grieved enough and do something about it. The guard on rotation when I arrived was old. You could tell with Sidarics by the armor. Theirs grew with them, plated over and over, and the old ones were thick with it, scarred, the stalks of the sensory crown gone gray at the tips. This one had been on Berth 9 longer than anyone could remember. The yard called it Sentinel, which wasn't clever, but yard names rarely were. Sentinel didn't speak. Sidarics could, through a vocoder in the armor, but this one hadn't in years, just stood at the line and faced the ship and watched. And the watching had a quality to it that I noticed before I had any business noticing anything. It wasn't the watching of a jailer. I'd seen jailers. This was something else. The way Sentinel held itself at that line, hour after hour, year after year, there was a grief in it that matched the ship's. Like the guard and the prisoner had been keeping each other company so long they'd started to feel the same thing. And I remember thinking, the first time I really looked at it, that the compact had it exactly wrong. They thought they'd posted a guard to contain a danger. What they'd actually done, without ever meaning to, was give the saddest thing in the galaxy the one thing it needed and would never ask for, which was someone to sit with it. I learned Sentinel's story sideways, the way I learned everything, and I'll give it to you here because by the end the guard mattered as much as the ship, and you should carry it the whole way through. The compact didn't post guards to Berth 9 as a punishment, not officially. Officially it was a posting of honor, the containment of the sector's gravest anomaly, a duty for the steadiest of the enforcer caste. But everyone knew the truth, the way everyone always knows. It was a posting you didn't come back from, right? The grief that came up off the Mourner didn't only reach the salvage crews who went inside. It reached, fainter but ceaseless, anyone who stood at that line, and the guards stood at that line every hour of every day, and so the compact rotated them. 6 months, then a transfer, then a long rehabilitation, because 6 months at Berth 9 was enough to put a crack in even a Sidaric, who were built to be uncrackable. They'd cycle through. 6 months gone, replaced. The yard barely learned their names. Except Sentinel never rotated out. I asked Dossier about it once. He said Sentinel had been there as long as he had, longer, and that there was a story, and the story was this. There'd been a rotation decades back, where the relief guard never came, some compact clerical failure, a transfer order lost in the machine, the kind of small bureaucratic death that an empire of forms produces by the thousand. And Sentinel, who was just a guard then, a young one due to be relieved, simply was not relieved. And a Sidaric's whole nature is duty. You do not leave your post until you are relieved. It is bred so deep into them it isn't even a choice. So Sentinel stayed, waited for a relief that the machine had forgotten to send, weeks, months. And by the time the error surfaced, if it ever did, if anyone ever even noticed, Sentinel had been at that line so long, soaking in the ship's grief, that something had happened that wasn't in any compact regulation. It had stopped being a guard, it had become a companion. Whatever order eventually came to rotate it out, it refused. That's the part of the story Dossier told Lois like it frightened him. A Sideric, the most obedient caste of the most orderly empire in the sector, had refused a direct rotation order, and the only refusal it gave, the only words it ever spoke on the matter, were, and Dossier swore these were the words passed down, it should not be alone. And the compact, faced with an enforcer that would not leave its post, did the thing bureaucracies do. They filed it. They reclassified the posting as permanent, attached Sentinel to it indefinitely, and stopped sending reliefs, because a guard who refused to leave was, on paper, a solved problem. The berth was contained, the form was satisfied, the box was ticked. They never asked why. They never once asked why a guard would chain itself to the saddest thing in the galaxy and refuse to be freed. Asking why was not a compact strength. But I asked why later, when Sentinel was finally speaking to me, and the answer it gave undid me, and I'll give it to you when we get there. For now just hold this. The ship had been alone for 40 years, and it had not quite been alone, because one creature built entirely out of duty had decided that the duty it owed was not to contain the grief but to keep it company. And the two of them had stood there at the cold end of the yard, the feared thing and its only friend, for longer than I'd been alive, waiting. Though neither of them would have said it, neither of them could have said it for someone to come who wasn't afraid. I didn't go down the cold end, not for a while. I want to be honest about that. I'm making myself sound braver than I was. For 3 weeks I obeyed the rule like everybody, and I sorted my plate and drained my tanks and earned my yard name. They called me Patch, because I kept fixing things that weren't mine to fix, mending broken gear in the work bays at night just because I couldn't stand to see it broken, and the name was half affection and half warning. It was the warning part that should have stopped me. Patch, the one who can't leave broken things alone. They named me the thing that was going to walk me down to Berth 9 before I'd ever decided to go. I want to tell you about the crew before I go further, because they matter, and because a scrapyard crew is a particular kind of family, and you can't understand what it cost me to break the yard's rules unless you understand that the yard was the only thing I had. We were maybe 40 hands on the day rotation, every shape and species you could think of, all of us out at the cold end of nowhere for reasons none of us discussed. That was the etiquette of the place. You didn't ask a man what he was running from. The yard names were part of it. You arrived with a real name and the yard took it away and gave you a new one based on what you did or what you were like. And after a while the old name fell off you entirely and you were just Dossier or Patch or Kettle or 2-ton. And whatever you'd been before stayed back in the lanes where you'd left it. I came to love that about the place. It was a yard for broken ships run by broken people, and nobody held your brakes against you, because everybody had their own. Dossier ran the sorting floor and had been at the reach longer than anyone except Sentinel. He was the one who'd warned me off 9, and I learned later why he knew too. There was Kettle, who ran the cooling ponds and sang while she worked, badly, constantly, old songs from a colony that didn't exist anymore. And you'd think it would drive you mad, and instead it became the thing that told you you were home. There was 2-ton, who wasn't human, who was one of the big, slow, patient species whose name I never could pronounce, and who could lift a hull plate that would take 4 of the rest of us, and who was the gentlest thing in the yard, who'd cup a dropped tool in 2 hands the size of shovels like it was a bird with a hurt wing. There was a kid we called Sparrow, younger than me, on the run from something he never named, who attached himself to me my first week the way the young ones do to anyone who's kind to them, and who I tried to keep clear of Berth 9 and failed, and that failing is part of this story too, later. We worked hard and we ate together in a long cold mess hall, and we drank a terrible distilled thing kettle made in a reclaimed coolant still. And at night, we slept in stacked bunks in the warm core of the asteroid where the heaters finally won, and it was a life. It was a good life, if I'm honest, the best I'd had in years, precisely because nobody asked anything of me except that I do my work and keep their secrets and let them keep mine. I'd been so broken when I came in. The yard didn't fix me. Places don't fix you any more than people do. But it gave me somewhere to be broken that didn't cost me anything, and I hadn't had that in a long, long time. And I think that's part of why the ship reached me when it didn't reach the others, because I knew what it was to be parked somewhere at the cold end of things, too broken to move, hoping nobody would come and also dying for somebody to. The crew had all run from something, but they'd run to the yard. They'd found their place. The ship hadn't run anywhere. It had been dragged here, and locked here, and left, and it had been waiting at the cold end for 40 years for the one thing the yard had given the rest of us, and never once offered it. Somewhere it was allowed to be broken without being taken apart for it. What finally took me down there was a small thing. It's always a small thing. It was the sound, or rather the lack of it. I'd worked a long double shift and I was crossing the yard late, alone, dead on my feet, and my route took me nearer the cold end than I usually went, and I stopped because I heard the silence. I'd heard about it. I'd felt the edge of it. But that night tired my guard down. I actually heard it. The way the whole roaring yard went around that one berth like water around a stone. And standing there at the edge of it, I felt something come up through the deck and into my chest, faint, the barest edge of it. And Dossier was right. It was sad. It was the saddest thing I had ever felt, and it was coming from the ship. And it was not an empty sadness. It was not a haunting. It was. And this is the thing that changed everything for me. The thing that made me break every rule in the yard. It was aware. It knew I was there. The sadness turned toward me, the way a person in a dark room turns their face toward a sound. Something inside that dead ship felt me standing at the line, 40 years into its grief, and it turned toward me, and it was so tired, and so alone, and so completely without hope of anyone ever coming, that the loneliness of it nearly put me on my knees right there. And I, being a fixer, being Patch, being the kind of fool who can't walk past a broken thing, I didn't run. Everybody ran. 3 salvage crews had run. 40 years of yard hands had kept their distance. And I stood there at the line, with the guard sentinel turning its gray-tipped crown slowly to look at me, the first thing it had looked at besides the ship in longer than anyone knew, and I did the thing you're not supposed to do. I talked to it. I didn't even mean to. It just came out of me quiet, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal, the way you'd speak to someone at a deathbed. I said, hey, I feel you, I'm here. And the silence, the great-shaped silence that had pushed the whole galaxy away for 40 years, the silence listened. That's where I have to stop for tonight, because that's where it really begins, and because everything after that night is a different kind of story than everything before it, and I need you to feel the line I crossed. The yard had one rule that mattered, and the rule was don't talk to it, and I talked to it, and it heard me, and nothing was ever the same. Not for me, not for the ship, not for the guard who'd faced it alone for 40 years, and not in the end for the Sideric Compact, who had built their whole empire on the idea that frightening things should be contained, and were about to learn what happens when somebody walks up to the most frightening thing of all and treats it, for the first time in its long grieving life, like it was hurt instead of dangerous. I'll pick it up there. I went back the next night. Of course I did. You don't feel a thing turn toward you in the dark, alone and 40 years lonely, and then just clock out and sleep. I went back, and the night after and the night after that, and I'm going to tell you what those nights were, because the records, the compact records, the ones that exist, make it sound like an event. A breach. An incident. It wasn't an event. It was a courtship. It was the slowest, most careful courtship in the world, and the thing I was courting was a war machine that had killed grown men with their own grief, and I want you to understand that I knew that every single night and went anyway. The first few nights I just stood at the line. That was all. I didn't try to go in, I wasn't a fool, whatever else I was, and I didn't even talk much after that first "I'm here." I just stood at the edge of the silence on my own time after my shifts, and I let it know I was there. That was the whole of it. The way you'd sit a little distance from a beaten dog and not reach for it, not yet, just let it learn your shape and your smell and the fact that you came back. Because that's the thing about a broken thing that's been hurt by everyone who ever approached it. The cruelty isn't the worst of what's been done to it. The worst is that it's learned that approach means harm. Every salvage crew that had ever come to the Mourner had come to take it apart. 40 years of that. Of course it cracked them open. Wouldn't you, if every single visitor in 40 years had walked in with a torch? So I came with no torch. I came with nothing. I came with my hands empty and open at my sides where it could see them, and I stood at the line, and I let the grief come up into my chest, and I didn't fight it. That was the thing none of the others had done. Dossier's crews braced against it. They felt the grief rising up through the deck, and they clamped down, walled it off, fought to keep it out, and the ship, feeling itself walled off yet again, pushed harder. The way a thing desperate to be heard gets louder when you cover your ears, until it broke through and broke them. I didn't wall it off. I let it in. I stood there and I let the saddest thing in the galaxy pour its grief into me. And yes, it hurt. It hurt more than I can tell you. It went straight for my own wreckage the way Dossier said it would, the marriage, the years I'd spent trying to fix a person and breaking myself on it, the particular shame of being a man whose whole gift is mending, and who could not mend the one thing he loved. It found all of that. It held it up in front of me. But here's what I did that nobody had done. I didn't try to survive it. I let it be true. I stood there and I let myself feel the worst thing I carried fully, the way you're never supposed to, and I said out loud to the ship, "Yeah, I know. I couldn't fix it either." And I wept. I stood at the line of Berth 9 and wept like I hadn't let myself weep in years. For my marriage and my failures and every broken thing I'd ever had to walk away from. And I let the ship see me do it. And the grief changed. I felt it change. It's the strangest thing I've ever felt, and I've spent years trying to find the words. The grief had been pouring out of the ship like water out of a breach, blind, desperate, drowning everyone it touched. And when I stopped fighting it, when I let it in and answered it with my own, it stopped pouring and started flowing. 2 directions. Mine going toward it, it's coming toward me, meeting somewhere in the cold air at the line. It wasn't drowning me anymore. It was grieving with me. And I understood, standing there soaked and shaking, what the Mourner had actually wanted for 40 years, the thing so simple that an empire of forms could never have filed it. It didn't want to hurt anyone. It wanted to not be alone in it. It had been grieving by itself for so long that its grief had become a weapon by sheer pressure, the way a held breath becomes a scream. And all it had ever needed was for one single living thing to grieve back instead of running. Sentinel watched all of this. I'd half forgotten the guard was there those first nights, it was so still. But the night I wept, I looked up afterward, wrung out, and Sentinel had moved. Not much. It had turned from the ship to face me, and it had come a half step closer, off its line, the line it had held for 40 years, and the gray-tipped stalks of its sensory crown were trained on me with an attention that I can only call astonishment. It had never seen this. In 4 decades at that post, it had watched crew after crew approach the Mourner and be broken by it, and it had never once seen a creature stand at the line and weep and walk away whole. I think I came to believe that Sentinel had stopped believing it was possible, that somewhere in those 40 years the guard had concluded the ship's grief simply could not be answered, only contained, and that the kindest thing it could do was stand watch so the broken thing wasn't entirely alone in a universe that feared it. And here was a human, a scrap hand, a nobody called Patch, doing the impossible thing on his own time after his shift with empty hands. It spoke to me on the 9th night. I'll never forget it because the voice was so ruined. Sideric vocoders are precise things, clipped and clear, the voice of an empire that values order. Sentinel's was a wreck, 40 years unused or near enough, and what came out was cracked and slow and strange, a voice relearning itself, and the first thing it ever said to me was a question, and the question was, "Why do you come back?" I didn't have a clever answer. I told it the truth. I said, "Because it's hurt, and I can't leave a hurt thing alone. I never could. It's the only thing I'm any good at." And Sentinel was quiet for a long time. The ship's silence wrapped around us both, and then it said the thing that I think it had been holding for 4 decades with no one to say it to. It said, "Neither could I." That was the night the guard and I stopped being a watcher and a trespasser and became 2 people sitting with the same broken thing. Sentinel told me, over the nights that followed, what it knew. It didn't know the ship's make either, that knowledge was lost with whatever war had birthed the Mourner. But it had stood with the ship for 40 years, and it had learned the shape of it the way you learn a person you sit with in silence, and what it had learned was this. The Mourner wasn't a haunted hull. It wasn't possessed. It was crude. Or it had been. The ship had a mind, not a built computer, something stranger, something the old lost war had made. A vessel that bonded with its crew so deeply that ship and crew became one grieving organism, the ship feeling what they felt, the crew steering by the ship's instincts. And its crew had died, all of them. Sentinel didn't know how: a battle, a plague, a slow failure of air in the dark, some ending lost to time. But the crew had died, every one, and the ship had not. The ship had not died. It had been built to feel its crew, and its crew was gone, and it could not stop feeling the place where they had been. 40 years. A war machine grieving a family it couldn't bury and couldn't follow and couldn't forget, alone in the dark, until grief was the only thing left running in it. And the grief had grown so vast that to come near it was to drown. It wasn't dangerous because it was a weapon. It was dangerous because it was bereaved. And there is nothing in the universe more dangerous than a powerful thing that has lost everything and has no one to grieve with. I started going inside. Slow, the way you do everything with a frightened thing. The first time I crossed the line into Berth 9 proper, Sentinel came with me, would not let me go alone, planted itself at my flank, and I understood that the guard had decided, somewhere in those nights, that its post was no longer the line. Its post was me. We went in together, into the dark of the Mourner, and the grief was an ocean in there. And I let it in, and I grieved, and the ship grieved with me. And inch by inch over many nights the ship learned that approach did not have to mean harm. And as it learned that, it began, very slightly, to wake. Not as a weapon. That's the thing the compact could never have predicted, the thing their whole frightened containment got exactly backwards. They were terrified that one day the Mourner would wake up and lash out, that the grief would turn to rage, that the saddest thing in the galaxy would become the deadliest. The opposite happened. As the ship learned it wasn't alone, the pressure came off the grief. The drowning silence began, faintly, to ease. Lights came up in the dead hull, dim, one at a time, like a person opening their eyes after a long illness. Systems that had been dark for 40 years stirred. Not to fight, to live. The Mourner was, for the first time since its crew died, beginning to believe it might be allowed to exist as something other than a tomb. And that, of course, is exactly when the compact noticed. You'd think a thing they'd feared for 40 years coming back to life would have brought a fleet. It didn't at first. It brought a clerk. That's the compact for you. A change in Berth Nine's status registered somewhere in the great machine of forms, an energy signature where there should have been none, and the machine generated an inquiry, and the inquiry generated an inspector, and one day there was a compact official standing in the yard with a data slate and a small, precise frown, asking Dossier why Anomaly 9 was showing power. His name, as near as it translated, was Overseer Kale. He was not an enforcer like Sentinel, he was administration, one of the soft-handed ruling species of the compact, the kind that had never held a weapon because it had whole castes to hold weapons for it. He was polite. He was thorough. He was, in his bloodless way, the most dangerous thing that had come to the yard in 40 years, more dangerous than the ship had ever been, because the ship only wanted to grieve and Kale wanted to file. He found me within a day. Of course he did. The yard's not big and I wasn't hiding. He found me and he was almost pleasant about it, and he laid out the situation in the gentle, relentless way of a creature who has never once doubted that the rules are reality. Anomaly 9 was showing unauthorized activity. The activity correlated with my access logs. They had logs. I should have known they'd have logs. I had breached a quarantine that existed for the safety of the entire sector. This was, he wanted me to understand, very serious. But it was also, he was pleased to say, recoverable. The anomaly had been dormant and contained for 40 years and could be returned to that state. The compact had developed, over those decades, a contingency for exactly this, for the possibility that the Mourner might one day reactivate. They had never used it because the ship had never woken. But it existed, and it was ready, and Kale, watching my face very carefully, explained what it was. They were going to kill it, cleanly, bureaucratically. They had a method, a cascade, he called it, something that would reach into the ship's strange, grieving mind and stop it, gently, completely, the way you'd put down a beast that had become a liability. No violence, no risk. Just a quiet correction, an anomaly returned to zero, a box ticked. And then Berth 9 would be a normal berth, and the Mourner would be scrapped like any other dead ship, and the sector would be safe, and the form would be satisfied, and everyone could stop being afraid. And the worst part, the part that I lay awake on after, was that Kale wasn't cruel. He genuinely thought he was being kind. To him, the ship was a suffering thing and a danger both, and ending it solved both problems at once, tidily, and he could not for 1 second comprehend why a scrap hand would object to the tidy ending of a suffering, dangerous thing. When I said no, when I said it was getting better, that it wasn't a danger, that it was healing, that all it had ever needed was someone to grieve with it, he looked at me with something close to pity, and he said the thing that told me everything about the compact and why this was going to come to a head. He said, "It is a weapon that has lost its purpose and learned to suffer. The kind thing and the safe thing are the same thing. We will end it. You are very strange to want otherwise." He gave me 3 days. Out of fairness, he said. 3 days before the Cascade team arrived to put the Mourner down. He thought he was being generous. He thought 3 days was plenty of time for a reasonable person to make peace with an obvious necessity. He did not understand that he had just given a man whose entire soul was built around the inability to walk away from a broken thing 3 days to figure out how to save the most broken thing in the galaxy from an empire that had decided to kill it out of kindness. I went down to the cold end that night and I sat inside the Mourner, in the dim stirring light of a ship learning how to live again, with Sentinel beside me, and I told them both what was coming. I don't know how much the ship understood in words, but it understood the grief in me, the way it always did, and I felt the ship's lights dim, felt the old drowning pressure begin to rise again, felt 40 years of course they would. Why would anyone come except to end me start to close back over the fragile thing we'd built, and I put my hand flat on the cold deck plate, the way you'd put a hand on a dying friend's chest, and I said, "No, not this time. I'm not running and I'm not letting them. I don't know how yet. But I didn't come back 9 nights and cross every line in this yard to watch them file you away. You hear me? You're not alone in it. Not anymore. Not ever again." And Sentinel, beside me in the dark, said in its ruined voice, "Then we do not let them." 2 of us. A scrap hand and a guard who'd refused his rotation. Against the compact and its cascade and 40 years of fear, and an overseer who thought killing the saddest thing in the galaxy was a mercy. 3 days. That's where part 2 ends, because the next part is the part the whole sector still argues about. The part where the galaxy that feared the ship found out what happened when you backed a human and a bereaved war machine and an old loyal guard into the cold end of a scrapyard, and told them they had 3 days to live. They told it after as if the ship rose up in fury. It didn't. I keep telling people it didn't, and they keep not believing me, because the truth is stranger and quieter and braver than the story they'd rather have. The ship didn't rise up. It knelt. I'll tell you what that means and what it cost and who was left standing when it was done. I'll pick it up there. I spent the first of my 3 days doing the thing I'm worst at, which is asking for help. I'm a fixer. Fixers don't ask. The whole sickness of us is that we'd rather break ourselves alone than admit a thing's too big for one pair of hands. But the Mourner was too big for one pair of hands, and I knew it. And so on the first morning I went to the mess hall and I stood up in front of the crew, Dossier and Kettle and 2-Ton and Sparrow and all of them, and I told them the truth. All of it. Where I'd been going at night. What the ship was. What the compact was going to do and when, and that I wasn't going to let them, and that I couldn't stop them alone. I expected them to call me a fool. Some of them did. Dossier stood up halfway through and walked out, and that hurt because of all of them. He was the one who'd been inside the Mourner, the one it had nearly killed with his own dead daughter, and I'd hoped, I don't know what I'd hoped, but the rest of them stayed. And Kettle, who sang badly and ran the cooling ponds and had been at the Reach almost as long as anyone, said the thing that turned it. She said, 40 years that thing's been parked down there and the compacts paid us to pretend it isn't suffering. We're scrap hands. We take apart the dead. But that thing's not dead. Patch is telling us it's not dead. It's just been left to die slow where nobody has to watch. She looked around the hall. I don't know about the rest of you. But I didn't come to the cold end of nowhere to help an empire kill something that just wants to not be alone. 2-Ton put one enormous hand flat on the table. That was its whole vote. It didn't need words. Sparrow the kid was already on his feet. I'd spent weeks trying to keep him clear of Berth 9 and failed because the young ones go where the kindness is, and the kindness in this story was all down at the cold end. I tried even then to tell him to stay out of it. He wouldn't. You're the one who told me this yard doesn't hold your brakes against you, he said. So I'm not gonna hold yours, I'm in. I couldn't argue him out of it. I've had a long time to be glad and sorry about that both. And Dossier came back, an hour later. He came back into the mess hall and he stood in the doorway and he said, Ruff, if we're doing this, we're doing it right, and you don't know the ship like I do. I've been inside. I know the dark of it. And that was Dossier's way of saying he was in. And it was the bravest thing any of them did, because he was the only one of us who'd already been broken by the Mourner once and was choosing to walk back into the thing that had nearly killed him. I never told him I understood what that cost. I think he knew. So we had a crew, a scrapyard crew against the compact. It should have been funny. It wasn't. Here's what I'd worked out, lying awake, about the cascade, about how you actually save the Mourner. And why it had to be the strange, quiet thing it turned out to be, and not the battle the sector likes to imagine. Kale's cascade wasn't a weapon you could fight. It didn't come on a ship you could ram or with soldiers you could bar the doors against. It was a signal, a precise, bureaucratic, surgical signal, designed over 40 patient years to reach into the Mourner's strange, grieving mind and switch it off, to find the thing that made the ship a living, bereaved organism, and simply, gently stop it. You couldn't shoot it down. You couldn't out-armor it. The only way to stop a signal that reaches into a mind is to make sure that, when it arrives, the mind it's reaching for isn't there to be switched off. And there was exactly one way to do that, and the ship was the one who showed it to me. I have to tell you about the last night before the Cascade team came, the second night of my 3, because it's the heart of all of it. I went down to the Mourner with the whole crew, and we worked 2-Ton hauling, Dossier reading the dark systems he half remembered, Kettle and Sparrow running lines, all of us inside a war machine that had killed people, and it let us. That's the thing, it let us. It had learned, in those nights with me, that approach didn't have to mean harm, and now a whole crew of scrap hands was moving through it with tools, and it understood we'd come to help. And it held its grief gentle around us the whole time so it wouldn't drown them. A 40-year-old killing silence, holding itself careful so it wouldn't hurt the people trying to save it. I think about that more than almost anything. And late, when the others rested, the ship showed me the thing. I felt it the way I'd felt everything from it, not in words, in grief, in knowing. It showed me what it was, all the way down, the bonded mind, the place where its dead crew still echoed. And it showed me that the bond could be moved, carried. That a cruise ship like the Mourner didn't keep its mind in a core you could point at. It kept its mind in the bond itself, in the living connection between ship and crew, and that bond had survived 40 years only because the ship had kept faith with a crew that was gone. But the bond could take a new anchor. It could bond again. Not replace the dead. It would never stop grieving them, and I'd never ask it to, but it could choose to belong to someone living. And if it did, if it anchored its mind in a living bond, then when the cascade came reaching for the lonely grieving thing it had been built to find, it would reach into Berth 9 and find a ship that was no longer that thing. A ship that belonged to someone. A ship that was crewed. It was asking me. That's what the grief was that last night. It was the Mourner, the saddest thing in the galaxy, asking a scrap hand named Patch if it could belong to him, if it could stop being the anomaly and start being someone's, if it could, after 40 years, have a crew again. And I want you to understand what that meant, because the word kneel in the title makes it sound like a defeat, and it was the opposite. It was the bravest surrender I've ever witnessed. To bond again, the ship had to lay itself open, voluntarily. It had to take all that grief, all that pressure, the weapon it had become, and set it down, kneel if you want the word, and make itself vulnerable to a living being, knowing what living beings do, knowing that they die, knowing that to love a crew is to sign up to lose them again someday. After 40 years of grieving the last ones, it chose to risk it again. It chose to belong to a thing that would die on it, rather than spend eternity safe and alone in its tomb. That's the kneeling. The galaxy feared the ship because it was a weapon that had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. A human made it kneel by giving it something to lose again. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I put my hand flat on the deck plate in the dim stirring light and I said yes, out loud. Yes, you're mine and I'm yours. You're not alone, you're crewed, you're crewed. And I felt the bond take, felt 40 years of unbearable solitary grief suddenly have somewhere to flow that wasn't outward into strangers, felt it pour into the bond between us and become, instead of a drowning weapon, simply sorrow, the ordinary survivable sorrow of a thing that has lost much and found something to live for anyway. The lights came up, all of them all at once, the Mourner waking fully for the first time in 40 years, and it was not terrible. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, a dead ship opening its eyes and choosing to live. And then the Cascade team arrived a day early. Kale, it turned out, had lied about the 3 days. Or not lied, bureaucracies don't lie, they just have contingencies you aren't told about, but he'd had the Cascade team standing by the whole time, and the moment the Mourner's full reactivation registered in his slate, he triggered them, because to him a ship coming fully alive wasn't healing. It was the exact catastrophe 40 years of containment had been built to prevent. The Cascade came that night early, while half my crew was still aboard. And here's where the story the sector tells goes wrong, and here's the truth. The Cascade reached into Berth 9 looking for the lonely, grieving anomaly it had been designed over 4 decades to kill, and it didn't find it, because the Mourner wasn't that thing anymore. It was crewed. It was bonded. It belonged to someone, and the signal built to switch off a solitary grieving mind slid off a ship that was no longer solitary and no longer only grieving, the way a key cut for one lock simply won't turn in another. The ship knelt, and the kneeling saved it. By making itself vulnerable by belonging, it had become something the Compact's 40-year weapon had no design to touch. But the Cascade had to go somewhere. A signal that powerful, reaching, finding its target gone, it didn't simply fail. It groped. It reached through the bond, looking for the mind it had been promised, and it found the bond, and it found at the other end of the bond me. I'll be honest about this part because I've been dishonest about it before to spare people, and I'm done sparing people. The Cascade found me. It came down the bond and it reached into the living anchor the ship had chosen, and for a moment, I don't know how long, time went strange. It was inside me the way it would have been inside the ship, trying to switch off a grieving mind, and it found mine, and mine was plenty grieving, and it took hold. I don't remember it clearly. I remember the lights. I remember Sentinel's ruined voice very far away saying my name, my yard name, Patch, Patch. The guard had a name for me. It had given me a name like the yard had, and I never knew until I was half gone and heard it calling me back. I remember the ship. I remember the Mourner understanding what was happening, that the thing built to kill it was killing its crew instead, that the price of its kneeling was about to be the very loss it had chosen to risk, and so soon, the first day of having someone, losing them already. And I remember the ship doing the last brave thing. It pulled the cascade back into itself. It opened the bond all the way, the bond it had just made, and it took the cascade off me and drew it into its own mind, deliberately, the thing it had knelt to avoid, because it would rather die switched off than watch its crew die in its place on the first day. 40 years it had grieved being left behind by the ones it loved. Given one chance, it chose to be the one who stayed behind instead. It chose to take the killing thing into itself to keep me. And it would have died. The cascade would have done to the Mourner exactly what Kale built it to do, and the saddest thing in the galaxy would have finally, gently, stopped. Except it wasn't alone in the bond anymore. That was the whole point of the kneeling, and the compact, in all its 40 years of planning, had never once accounted for it, because it had never been able to imagine the variable. The bond went two ways. The ship reached to take the cascade and die for me, and I reached back, and Sentinel reached. The old guard throwing 40 years of its own held grief into the bond. And the crew, Dossier and Kettle and Two-Ton and Sparrow, none of them bonded but all of them there. Hands on the deck, grieving with it, refusing to let it be alone in the dying the way it had been alone in the living. And the cascade, which was built to switch off one solitary grieving mind, found itself reaching into a thing that was a scrap hand and a guard and a ship and a whole crew of broken people all holding the grief together, all of us, at once, sharing it so wide in so many ways that there was no single mind for it to stop. It had been designed for one lonely thing. It met a family. And it had no instruction for a family. It groped through all of us looking for the one grieving mind it could kill, and it could not find it, because we had spread it so thin between us that it was nowhere and everywhere and belonged to no one alone. The cascade failed. It guttered out in the bond like a flame in too much air. I came back. The ship lived. We all lived. That's the part I can hardly believe even now, that we all walked out of Berth 9, every one of us, the first crew in 40 years to go in and come out whole, because we'd gone in to grieve with it instead of to take it apart, and grief shared is the one weight that gets lighter the more hands you put under it. Kale never understood it. I saw him after in the yard staring at his slate at a cascade that read as expended, an anomaly that read as fully active, and a containment that read as failed, every number wrong, every box unticked, the orderly universe he believed in simply not matching the readout. He looked at me and he said, almost plaintive, it should be dead. The kind thing was to let it die. And I told him the truth, the only true thing I had for him. I said, you thought the kind thing was to stop its suffering. The kind thing was to share it. You never could have known that. It's not in any of your forms. The compact, faced with a fully active Mourner that had killed no one, harmed no one, that was bonded to a human work crew, and showed no sign of the danger 40 years of fear had promised, did the thing bureaucracies do when reality refuses their forms. They reclassified it. Anomaly 9 became registered vessel, crewed, owned, accounted for. A box ticked a different way, and they withdrew their cascade and their overseer and their fear, because a thing that is owned and crewed and filed is not frightening to a compact. It is simply entered. They never apologized. They never understood. But they let it live because we'd made it into a shape their forms could hold, and that in the end was the whole trick of it. The galaxy feared the ship because it was a weapon with nothing to lose. We didn't defeat that. We just gave it something to lose, and a weapon with something to lose isn't a weapon anymore. It's just someone trying to get home. The Mourner flies now. It has a real name now, one the ship chose that I won't tell you because it's the ship's and not the story's. Sentinel cruise it with me. The old guard finally relieved of its post after 40 years, not by the compact, who'd forgotten it, but by the only thing that could ever have relieved it, which was the grieving thing it had refused to leave finally being all right. Dossier comes sometimes. Kettle sings on the bridge, still badly. 2-ton is our muscle and our gentlest soul. Sparrow's grown now, a real spacer, and I never did manage to keep him clear of the cold end, and I'm so glad. People still ask me how a human made the most feared ship in the galaxy kneel. They want the loud version. They want the battle. I tell them the truth and they're always disappointed. I didn't make it kneel. I knelt first. I went down to the cold end with empty hands and I knelt at the line of the saddest thing in the galaxy, and I wept with it until it understood that being approached didn't have to mean being taken apart. The kneeling was never a defeat. It's just what love looks like when you've forgotten anyone could offer it. The galaxy feared a weapon. All it ever was someone left alone too long with their grief, waiting for one person to walk up and not be afraid. That's the whole secret. Dossier had it right on my first day, he just had the ending wrong. It's the saddest thing in the galaxy. But it isn't sad anymore.